Hello, everyone. We're wrapping up Mints this week in this kind of hybrid week that we have in week 5 and shifting into talking about Douglas Harper's Changing Works. We're coming a lot closer to home with a book that is about the dairy industry in upstate New York. And I'm going to say a little bit about it for discussion this week and to kind of introduce the book as we work on it over the next couple of weeks. Harper is a sociologist who, in his several books that he's written, including Changing Works, really focuses on these kind of lost worlds. And you can see that that's actually in the subtitle of the work, Visions of a Lost Agriculture. So in this particular work, he's kind of continuing a theme where he's looked at people who are like railroad hobos and ride the rails back are part of kind of like popular culture and songs in the early 20th century. He did a study of a small town mechanic in upstate New York near Potsdam that some of you read about if you took my research methods course last semester in a book called Working Knowledge, and a couple other ones as well, where he's really interested in how is it that certain aspects of traditional communities are changing and kind of we're losing them as part of the move to more kind of a capitalist-centered economy and culture, and as we move into modernity. So he's really interested in the forces that cause these changes and how they cause changes within particular communities. In the case of Changing Works, really interested in dairy communities. And so that's the focus here and the connection with our course on food. He's also interested in seeing any pockets, any places where those traditional forms of community and work are still present. So even though we're kind of losing these places, are there spaces where these kind of more traditional forms of community are still going strong in some way, or at least maybe kind of surviving, even if they're not totally going strong? He uses this key research methodology called the photo elicitation interview. The idea here is that you can do an interview that includes questions that you would ask of a research partner, but at the same time, maybe you can use pictures to help supplement those texts or really to kind of drive the interview by themselves. And he has this whole treasure trove of historical photos from farming in the early to mid 20th century that he really uses in his work, and that you can see kind of peppered all throughout the book that help us understand this community and kind of how things used to be done and maybe some of the things that have been lost. And so in combination with oral history with retired farmers and others who are doing this work and were still alive and around when he did the writing for this book and the research for it, he uses this photo archive that was taken as part of a project during the Great Depression to document ways of life in farming communities, including in upstate New York and really kind of in our backyard. And so you can see an example on page 9. He has a image of this farmer doing some pruning in an apple tree. Would it be around this time of year? Actually, a little bit later, early in the year, in the winter time, when a farmer would be pruning trees. And he kind of does this as a little study. If you look carefully at the picture and read the caption that he includes on page 9, Harper shows the methodology, because a little demo of the methodology of photo elicitation and how to kind of read a picture in a sociological way to kind of get a sense for what kinds of meanings, what kinds of data we can gather from it. So take a close look at that example on page 9 and then see if you can apply that. We're going to want to talk about this in coming class sessions and see if you can maybe choose some pictures to do this same type of analysis to, and see if we can really read deeply into them, see what meanings and associations we can pull from them. Harper's book is really rich in that sense, to have all those images and imagery that we can use as kind of our own exercise and our own data source for the themes that we're talking about in this class. And overall, it's just a really nice method for studying work, because work is an active thing. It involves practices, it involves techniques and tools that are active. And so in some ways, if we can capture them with photos or videos, we can kind of see what's going on, and we can use that as a way of documenting work that's happening or work that maybe happened in the past and is lost, and we want to understand what the impact of that is. So what does it mean to say that work is embedded in communities? That's kind of the story that Harper's trying to tell us, to understand how work is central organizing feature of communities and how that gets changed and disrupted in the period where agriculture and in tandem, these communities are radically changing through, especially the 20th century, and even still today, as I'll talk about a little bit later in this lecture. So one thing we can start with then is a question of what exactly community means and why is it kind of significant for Harper's study. And I think another way to phrase that is what ties communities together. Obviously, in his study, and really, probably kind of just as a basic definition for community, is that there's an economic interdependence within communities. Communities are tied together through shared needs, shared markets, exchange of goods. Especially traditionally, the community would have been kind of the key site for people to produce food for their own families and for other community members, maybe in some cases bartering and exchanging their products that they're growing on their own farms for other things that they need. And we'll see some examples of this, actually some really specific examples of this in a few weeks when we read Farmer Boy, as kind of treating that as a historical document related to farming communities in upstate New York as well, because that's where it was written about. They also have a shared culture, oftentimes a shared set of beliefs or values, and that involves practices, especially work practices that might really combine those two things, the work that it takes to produce the goods that you might use for your own economic and physical survival, as well as the exchange that you might do with other people. And those go together then with the beliefs or the values, the meanings that you put into that work, into those practices. So really, work is kind of this thing that helps pull together both economic needs and values as well as cultural values as well. So kind of a connection, I guess you could say, to those inside and outside meanings to some degree that Mintz talked about in his study of sugar. So overall, if we look at the rhythm of these traditional agricultural communities, they're based on a production cycle that's seasonal. When do you prune your apple trees? When do you bring in other crops? When do you milk your cows? When do you dry them off so that they can get some rest and that you can maybe calve and start again the following year? And how does that fit with the other kind of cultural seasons that would be related to that? Things like, when do you do certain types of work? Do you rely on your neighbors for doing it? Do you have certain celebrations or holidays or traditions that are part of that? There's this way in which there's a rhythmic shift from season to season in farming communities, especially in these traditional settings. Then a big part of Harper's story is how that changes. And if we really think back to the reading that we did from Lyson's book, Civic Agriculture, we had a couple of chapters that we read from that where he tried to describe some of the changes that happened to agriculture and give a kind of a broader brush picture than the more specific case study that Harper's giving us in Changing Works. He really talked about how there were some shifts in government policy, the rise of land-grant universities. This is a little bit of a review here. We talked about this in class, and I mentioned it in a previous lecture recording as well. But overall, that led to kind of the rise of industrial agriculture and a shift away from these more community-centered models of farming, and really a focus on productivity and economic efficiency instead of, or as a way of kind of pushing aside more kind of community-centered focus on agriculture. So Lyson and some of the tools that he gave us in that prior reading kind of help set the context for policy and history that Harper is telling in his story about the dairy industry. And so there's a little bit of overlap here. Remember, we talked about this idea of technological treadmills and how once you adopt a technology, you kind of maybe feel like you kind of have to compete with other farmers when they upgrade their technology or when they bring on something new. If that increases efficiency, it can drive down prices, and you basically have no choice but to get on that treadmill and stay on it that way. And Lyson talked about those interrelated technological revolutions of the mechanical ones, the chemical, and the biotechnology. And Harper really talks about several of those, not so much the biotech part, but especially the mechanical one and some of the other key changes to farming practices that were advised for people to employ during this time period by cooperative extension, by the land-grant university system, and probably learning from your neighbors too. Things like tractors, changes to the ways that cows were milked in the barns and the milking parlors, ways of trying to assess milk properties like buttermilk fat content and so forth. That you could test and kind of track the productivity of cows. And if they start to go down in terms of the amount that they make of milk or the butterfat content, then you cull them from your herd and replace them with a different cow. Things like crop hybrids, including especially hybrid corn, is a big change in especially the role of corn itself in feed for livestock, including cows and dairy cows, and then changes to cattle varieties as well. And so really a much more specific focus on these black and white spotted cows that we think of as the kind of prototypical cow for dairying, the heifer, and how those replaced the more diverse set of breeds that would have been common, much more common in farm fields in dairying regions in the U.S. and around the world prior to that system of changes. All these shifts then led to a really long-term consolidation of farming, including here in central New York, where you have fewer and fewer farms overall, fewer and fewer dairy farms, and the ones that are left get bigger and bigger and really try to concentrate production and efficiency around that larger farm, most of the time with more cows too. So we can actually see just a few trends that we can grab from data that's available to us through the Census of Agriculture. Just like we have a U.S. Census that's done every 10 years, there's a Census of Agriculture that's done roughly around every 5 or so years. And so the most recent National Census of Agriculture is from 2017. And you can see here for Madison County, they have kind of a fact sheet that includes some details about farms in general in the county. So the number of farms in 2017 was just under 700 at 691, and that's a reduction of 18% since the prior census in 2012. You can see that there's fewer number of acres of land in farms too there, that's gone down, and that at the same time the average farm size has gone up by 11% during that same period. So that's that same kind of trend of at the same time number of farms going down but size of farms going up because of that consolidation. So more specifically for dairy, we can see that for the county as a whole, agricultural products of all kinds were worth a little bit more than $113 million in 2017. And milk from cows made up a pretty big portion of that, over $71 million. So dairy is still the predominant agricultural industry or product in the county. And so that kind of history that we have of being a dairy county where agriculture is still the number one economic factor or driver in the county, at the same time, that those numbers have gone down over time. And even though farming is still a big part of what we see in the county, the stresses and strains from being a dairy farmer and the pressures from technological change and lower milk prices have led to a real decrease of farms overall. We can kind of see this if we just drive through the countryside around here. Abandoned farms or farms that look kind of like they've seen better days, alongside the still existing farms. So again, from Census of Agriculture data, we can see that in 1998, dairy farms in Madison County, there were almost 291 just dairy farms we're talking here, not all farms of the type that I mentioned on that previous slide from Census of Agriculture data. By the time 2007 came around, that was down below 200 farms at 198, and the most recent data I could find from 2018 down to 153 dairy farms. So basically about half of the number that we had in 1998, 20 years ago. So 50% reduction in that period of time. So the trends that Harper is talking about are trends that still really hold in a lot of ways today, that we still see in effect. And we know from the current pandemic that there's been a real shock to milk prices, and some of the things we've talked about in class, like milk dumping that have been in the news and stuff, are related to some of these same pressures that dairy farmers feel. So this is something we want to talk about in class, is some of these technological changes, to what extent they're impacting agriculture and are part of Harper's story. And so we'll talk about that more in class. See you soon.